So welcome, good evening, everyone. My name is Federica Cocoluzzi, and I'm one of the organizers of the Writing Transnational Girlhood seminar series. I'm very happy to see so many of you here. As anticipated, we had to move the seminar. We decided to move the seminar to the Monday in order to respect the UCU strike that will take place on Thursday, the 24th. Unfortunately, we also had another change to our schedule as our first speaker, Andrea Fernandez Garcia, could not join us today due to personal health reasons. We are, however, nevertheless delighted to have Laura Leden with us today. I just want to remind you, as I said, that this series is recorded and will be turned into a podcast that will be available on the Institute website. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, who is Laura Leden, a translation scholar from the University of Helsinki in Finland. She wrote her PhD thesis on adaptation of the image of girlhood in translations of girls' fiction from English to Swedish and Finnish. She has also published several articles on translations books by L.M. Montgomery. The title of our paper today is The Female Author Domesticated, The Journey of L.M. Montgomery's Family Visualized in Common Illustrations and Other Paratexts. Over to you, Laura.
Yes, thank you, Olga. So indeed, I will be talking about the Canadian author L.M. Montgomery today and about her Emily trilogy. Which is a female Bildungsroman story about the young orphan girl called Emily Bird Starr and her journey to becoming a woman and an author. Today, Montgomery's books are known as classics among girls' fiction, that is, books for girls, about girls and girlhood. However, originally, Montgomery's books were written for a crossover audience of adults and teenage girls, which was noted in contemporary reviews. In the Emily trilogy, the protagonist Emily is characterized as a very creative, imaginative, and thus empowered girl. These characteristics are enhanced by her strong interaction with nature and literature, as her experiences in nature and the books she reads inspire her own writing and are a central part of her journey to becoming an author. By foregrounding Emily's creative agency and her ambitions to become a writer, Montgomery subversively challenges the conventions of traditional female gender roles, placing women mainly in a domestic sphere. In this paper, I will look at how Emily's agency and empowerment are represented in paratexts such as cover illustrations, titles, and plot summaries. I will compare the paratexts of the original Emily books from the 1920s to those from their abridged Swedish, Norwegian, and Finnish translations, which are from the 1950s and 1960s. As children's literature scholar Perry Nodelman notes, illustrators can choose one moment only of stopped action out of all the events the text accompanying it describes. This resembles Gerard Genet's definition of paratexts as the threshold to the book. Paratexts are made to sell the book and thus also reflect what kind of text the publishers assumed readers wanted to read, or in the case of juvenile books, what kind of books they assumed adults would buy for children. The aspects of the text chosen to represent it in its paratexts greatly impact the reader's initial expectations and can also influence the reader's interpretation. Let's see what the original paratexts of the Emily books can tell us about the protagonist. The original titles on covers from the 1920s that you can see here highlight imagination, nature, and reading, which shows Emily's empowering agency and supports the interpretation of the books as proto-feminist texts. The first title, Emily of New Moon, reflects Emily finding a home and identifying with the New Moon homestead. The second title, Emily Climbs, presents Emily as an active protagonist by referring to her writerly journey on something called the Alpine Path, which is an intertextual reference to a poem about the quest for literary success that features prominently in the books. And the third and final title, Emily's Quest, is a further reference to this quest for success. The original covers by an illustrator called Maria Louise Kirk support the empowering titles by foregrounding Emily's imagination and creativity by showing her in interaction with literature and nature. On the first cover, Emily's experiencing creativity in nature as we see her imaginary friend, the Wind Woman, lurking behind her. On the second cover, Emily is reading several books while surrounded by inspiring nature, and on the third cover, she's reading and perhaps also writing, surrounded by several books and manuscript pages. The original titles and covers depict Emily as an empowered protagonist with a high level of agency. Then to the Nordic translations. Though the Emily trilogy was originally written for a crossover audience of adults and teenage girls, in the 1950s and 1960s in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, the books were published as abridged translations, targeting a younger audience than Montgomery's originals. The primary motivation for the abridgment was commercial, as the translations were published in a juvenile publisher series with restricted page counts. Publisher series that targeted a specific age group and gender were a common phenomenon within children's literature publishing in the Nordic countries in the 1950s. They were cheap to produce and easy to market due to their uniform page counts and covers. In my previous research, my textual analysis of the Swedish and Finnish translations has shown that the abridgments concern mainly nature descriptions, intertextual references, and Emily's challenging of authority and traditional gender roles. These kinds of abridgments result in that Emily's agency and empowerment are suppressed. In juvenile publisher series, the target ages of the books were often noted in code on the back covers of the books, as you can see here on this slide. These images are from the Swedish Emily translations published by the publisher Glerup in their series of juvenile books called Glerups ungdomsböcker, that is Glerup's juvenile books. The target groups in Sweden were girls aged 10 to 14, 11 to 15, and 11 to older, as you can see here. And to meet the publisher's page count requirements, the Swedish Emily trilogy underwent a major modification. The first two books, called Emily of New Moon and Emily Climbs, were actually split into 3 volumes, as you can see here. The third book, Emily's Quest, was not translated at all into Swedish in the 1950s. Perhaps its content was considered inappropriate for the young target audience of the publisher's juvenile series, since this book is about Emily's early adulthood from the age of 17 to 24. The only thing we know is that the editor, Ingrid Schar, wrote in her correspondence that she considered the third book not as good as the other 2. Regardless of the reason, the Swedish 1950s readers were presented with an abridged version of Emily's story that ends with Emily finishing high school and choosing not to leave her village, rather than with becoming a published author as in the original trilogy. Her writerly journey is much shorter in the Swedish version, and the ending reinforces rather than challenges early 20th century female gender norms, confining women to a predominantly domestic sphere, removed from professional or public creative work. A few years later, the Norwegian publisher Eskehö made Norwegian versions of the Emily books inspired by the Swedish editions. No publisher series is mentioned on the Norwegian books, but they have a similar abridged format as Montgomery's Norwegian Anne of Green Gables books, published in Eskehö's series called Eskehö's Utvalgte for piker, which means Eskehö's selection for girls. It's evident that the Norwegian translations are partly based on the 1950 Swedish ones, as the books were split in the same way in Sweden as in Sweden, and the third book was left out. However, the Norwegian translations targeted even younger readers than the Swedish ones, as the target age noted on all three books is girls aged 9 to 14. The third Nordic publisher to release the Emily books in the post-war period was the Finnish publishing house VS Oy, or Werner Söderström, who revised and abridged their all 1920s translations at this point. The revised versions published in 1961 in their juvenile series called Kuolemattomia tyttökirjoja, or Immortal Girls Books, were partly based on the 1950 Swedish translations as well. Thus, the Swedish influence was considerable also in Finland, though the Finnish publisher maintained the original division of the books and included the third book in their Emily series. No specific target age is mentioned on the Finnish books, but targeting a younger audience is evident from the abridgment. Let's take a look at how the Nordic publishers chose to present and market their abridged Emily translations in their paratexts. I will focus on the presence and absence of the empowering elements of nature and literature, both of which inspire Emily's creativity in her books. So here's the Swedish versions again. The Swedish title of the first book, which is in English Emily of New Moon, is plainly Emily in Swedish. So the original focus on home is lost by foregrounding the protagonist's name only. The second, rather generic and childish title is Hennes vänner, which means Emily and her friends. And this focuses on Emily's relationships to her friends. Only the third title, which is Emily på egna vägar, or Emily follows her own path, indicates some kind of development and the budding independence of a young girl. Emily's writerly ambitions are not referred to in any of the Swedish titles, but they do appear on the cover illustrations. As you can see here, the first cover shows Emily writing a letter, which is something she often does in the book. This creative agency is lost on the later covers. The second cover picturing Emily with her cat is the most domestic. On the third cover, Emily carries a notebook with her name on the cover, which hints at her writing, though it could also be interpreted as a school book that she's carrying. However, all three covers show Emily in a domestic setting, either inside or outside her home, either at New Moon or in Shrewsbury, where she later goes to school. Nature only appears in the background, and Emily is not shown to interact with the landscape. Similarly, All of the plot summaries on the back covers of the books focus on describing Emily's relationships to her relatives and friends. The first summary introduces her strict Aunt Elizabeth, kind Aunt Laura, and funny cousin Jimmy. The second one describes her friends and teachers, while the third one focuses on how Emily eventually develops a friendship with her grumpy Aunt Ruth in Shrewsbury. Emily's writer dreams and imagination are mentioned only briefly in the summaries and sound more like a hobby than a career ambition, like in the original, though the publication of her first poem is acknowledged in the third plot summary. Then over to Norway. The first Norwegian titles differ from the Swedish titles, despite that the Norwegian publisher used the Swedish split of the books. The first Norwegian title, Emily på Månegården, which means Emily on Moon Farm, pretty much replicates the original title, Emily of New Moon, which has a focus on home, while the second Norwegian title, Emily reiser bust, or Emily Goes Away, indicates leaving home and foregrounds Emily's visit to another eccentric aunt in the book. The third Norwegian title, Emily på egne veier, or Emily Follows Her Own Path, implies more independence and is the same as the third Swedish title. Thus, the three Norwegian titles present the books as a journey away from home, that is, the young protagonist growing up. Like the Swedish ones, the Norwegian cover illustrations that you can see on this slide all have domestic settings. Nature is not pictured at all, while writing is hinted at on two of the covers by Emily handling a manuscript in a seemingly dissatisfied manner in the second image and passively carrying a notebook in the third one. This set of three illustrations shows Emily moving from an outdoors environment to an indoors environment and indicates a development towards romance, since the last image pictures Emily and a male character, presumably her romantic interest Teddy. The Norwegian plot summaries, like the Swedish ones, focus on Emily's challenging relationships with her aunts that don't know how to bring up an imaginative child like Emily. The third Norwegian plot summary reveals that the series ends with Emily choosing to stay at New Moon, dreaming about writing and the future with Teddy rather than going to New York, which strongly emphasizes romance and traditional gender roles. And lastly, we have the case of the Finnish titles are completely different from the Swedish and Norwegian ones, as they do focus on Emily's writerly ambitions in a similar way as the original titles do. This may be because the Finnish titles created in the 1920s were reused for the revised 1960s editions. The first Finnish Emily book is called Pieni runotyttö, which introduces Emily as the little poem girl. This title has resulted in that the Emily books are known as the poem books in Finland, rather than as the Emily books, like in the English-speaking world. So the Finnish title indicates creativity and agency, but the use of the adjective little can be interpreted to belittle Emily's ambitions. The following books do drop the adjective and are called only Runotyttö maineen polulla, that is the poem girl on the path to fame, and Runotyttö etsii tähteään, that is the poem girl looking for her star. These empowering titles focus on Emily's writerly journey and quest for success. However, the Finnish cover illustrations that you can see on this slide feature Emily's writing least of all three Nordic sets. The first cover shows Emily outdoors in a nature setting, while the other two illustrations move Emily to indoor settings, showing her first in a romantic dance scene with Teddy, and then looking longingly at the moon outside, holding an empty notebook. The heroine seems more passive than active in these. Similarly, the brief Finnish plot summaries describe Emily only as a talented girl who grows up into a young lady in the care of her strict Aunt Elizabeth, which once again focuses on Emily's relationships and the domestic aspects of the books rather than on her ambitions. So this paratextual analysis of the Nordic Emily translations and their paratexts published in the 1950s and 1960s and targeted at young girls shows that the Nordic publishers' presentation of the books focuses on domestic and romantic elements rather than on Emily's writing ambitions and inspiring interaction with nature and literature. This is not surprising, as empowering elements like nature descriptions and intertextual interaction with literature are similarly reduced in the abridged translations themselves. The Swedish, Norwegian, and Finnish paratexts suppress Emily's identity as a female author in favor of a more domestic identity. Agents in the form of reading and writing and interactive experiences in nature inspiring her imagination seen in the original paratexts play mostly peripheral roles in the titles, cover illustrations, and plot summaries of the translations. My examination of how paratexts characterize Emily's journey through the presence and absence of the empowering elements of nature and literature shows that the Nordic cover illustrations depict Emily's development during the series as moving from the outside world and nature to increasingly domestic indoor environments as she grows older. Comparing the paratexts of the originals and the translations reveals a tension between traditional marital and domestic expectations and creative career ambitions, as the paratexts of the translations confirm rather than challenge traditional gender roles. The Nordic paratexts show Emily as a more domestic role model than the original books and suppress the empowering role nature, writing, and creativity play in Montgomery's texts. So thank you, that was my talk, and here you can see my references used in this paper and some articles I have written about the Emily books. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. And here you can find my contact details as well.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was a very fascinating talk, and I have tons of questions for you. I am a book historian by election, not really by training, but by election. And this discourse on the way in which the paratext can become a vehicle of ideological rereading of a text and reshaping ideas of a girlhood is certainly enthralling and intriguing on a multiplicity of in a multiplicity of ways. So thank you very much for sharing your work with us today. Before asking my questions, I want to see if there is anybody who wants to jump in first. Otherwise, I'll start, and then we can get the conversation rolling. And remember that you can raise your yellow digital hand. Otherwise, just connect.
Yes. Do you want me to stop sharing the PowerPoint?
Yeah, if you like. So yeah, if you like to, yeah. Very sorry for my cough. Hopefully, won't be so. Okay, so I'll start the questions myself. so that we can see what others think as well. One question I have is, relates to the publishing history of your text, and specifically the contemporary afterlives of those texts. My question is, has the original been restored for a modern readership, considering how important the empowering girlhood discourse has become in modern publishing? It has been vastly exploited in a certain way, with all the manuals for rebel girls and all of that. So that kind of novels would certainly play well with the modern audiences, also in terms of commercial success and commercial revenue. But have those books been restored, or are they continue to be sold and circulating in this abridged and ideologically manipulated manner?
Yes, so when it comes to the Emily books, there has not yet been any new complete translations in any of these 3 countries. But I very recently heard some very good news, as in Finland there will actually be published a new complete translation in next June. And people are very happy about this, because these books are very beloved in all of the Nordic countries.
Exactly, and that's my other question. That I think that really bridges me in very nicely. Thank you very much. What is the response, the contemporary as well as the past response to this text? So yes, as you mentioned, they were and they continue to be quite beloved, and I imagine they also passed from mothers to daughters in a sense. But again, is there a perception of the abridgment or the manipulation being made, or not? What we in the response is like, I also work in something similar, like in a similar field, and one thing that I look at are periodical reviews and the way those convey idea and help shape the reception of the work within like broader readerships. So I don't know if you investigated any of that.
Well, the readers and probably also the reviewers didn't know that the books were abridged, as it doesn't say so in any of the editions of the book. So reviewers don't really comment on the abridgment. But readers that hear about my research are, of course, very, very surprised and very disappointed to hear that they didn't read or that the version they loved isn't the original version.
That's very, very interesting. And we have a question from Patricia Montenegro, who says, "Hi Lara, was there any specific socio-political contexts in Finland, Norway, or Sweden that allowed for more traditional readings and drawings of Emily? Thank you," she says. Thank you, Patricia, for your question.
Yeah, I think it was in general the time period, which was the 1950s, which was very, very different from today. But I think the main reason to these abridgments was that the books were targeted at the younger audience rather than this like double audience that Montgomery originally had. So a lot of the abridgments involve, for example, irony that is directed more at older readers, and also things like nature descriptions that they thought that young readers would not find that interesting. So
okay, sorry, it's me, it's Patricia. I do understand that, but perhaps there was something in particular. Of course, there are 3 different countries with their own socio-political backgrounds, but even there might have been something, that's me thinking about it, that might have also pushed the publishers to read and obviously understand those texts in a more traditional and conservative way.
Yeah, but it's very interesting that one of these countries is Sweden, which was like a very progressive country. If we take, like, you might know Pippi Longstocking by Astrid Lindgren, that was published at about the same time, and that's about, well, a very, very brave and different girl who breaks all kinds of norms. So that being published speaks for that breaking norms was possible in these countries at this time, but just not in translations, because usually when like trends change, it happens first in the original works, and translations apply or use the older norms, and it takes some time before the change happens in the translated literature as well. This is something that other researchers have discovered as well.
Right, okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have another question from Fatma Följetepe. Hi, is there any comparable girl stories from the Emily time or later, at least in the Finnish context? Do girl representations differ in terms of text or paratext in case there are any such girl books? That's an excellent question. Thank you very much, Fatma.
Yeah, again, the books by Montgomery and Louisa May Alcott and all those were actually models for early Finnish books for girls. So I would say the original Finnish books published about this time were very, very similar to Montgomery's books, similar plots, and also, of course, for example, the cover images were very similar because it was the style of that time, and even often the same illustrators were used for the same types of books.
That's very interesting on two levels, because on the one hand, it feels like the Nordic countries were importing models of girlhood in a way, but at the same time bending them to their own ideologies and needs and practical needs as well. Because if you have to reorient the readership, or to if you want a younger readership to access the book, then of course you have to, well, depends, of course, but you want to change certain elements to make it more readable, to enhance its readability, but at the same time protect its moral, like the moral and ethical values that perhaps you as a country want to circulate. And the other thing is about the illustrations. The illustrations are very interesting. The original ones are beautiful and very hairy, and as I noticed that as we go along with the different editions, they become more and more realistic in a sense, and bound to also fashionable elements that perhaps make the text more relevant to the present readership of the time. And I wonder whether there are more illustrations throughout the books, or it's just the illustration element is also in the frontal paratext, not throughout. It's not used throughout as a continuous paratext.
No, there is no illustrations inside the books, but of course there has been many new editions since these ones that have had different cover images.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, we have got more Emily's than these ones.
Mm-hmm. Very good. That's very interesting. And Fatma says also, what does this conflicting text and paratext messages mean in the Nordic context? The clash between the paratext and the text, if there is one, or how do they align?
Well, there are similar, or there are kind of conflicts both within the paratexts and the text, because as you saw, some of the paratexts do have elements that show Emily writing and having agency, and then there's other elements that are more domestic. So there's both sides are included, but it's kind of something, it's like the domestic side increases a bit in the Nordic illustrations, and the same applies to the texts themselves. Montgomery's texts are more, original texts are more norm breaking than the translations, but this doesn't mean that all of the norm breaking has been omitted in the translations. So it's just kind of a gradual shift towards one pole, but what we if you remove all of the norm breaking and all of the literature and nature from Montgomery's books, there would not be much left. So yeah, there is still a lot of norm breaking going on. It's just less. So this is important to remember, that not all of these kind of elements have been removed, just some.
Amazing, thank you very much. I'm always turning off this my mic so that I avoid coughing in our recording. We have another question from Antonella De Nicola, who says, could we compare these abridged versions by Montgomery to those from books by Dickens or any other more classical author? She's thinking of George Sand, for instance. So 19th century literature that had this very, very strong appeal on young readerships.
Yeah, that would be a very interesting study to make, because I'm sure there has been abridged versions of texts like Dickens as well. I don't know if anyone has studied those, but almost all texts from this like 1950s and earlier periods that have been studied do show different kinds of abridgments. Even texts aimed at adults could be abridged at that time. To take a completely different example from research by a Finnish colleague of me, she looked at translations of Finnish books published in English in the UK, and she looked at some very highly regarded Finnish classics and found that they were abridged in the UK in a similar way. So there were like similar omissions in those texts as there were in the Emily books. So for example, longer descriptive passages were omitted to make this Finnish classic more plot-driven in the UK, whereas Emily was made more plot-driven in Finland. So it was just something that happened in all directions and in all kinds of literature.
Oh, yeah. It's very, that's definitely very noteworthy. And yes, so Antonella was saying Little Dorrit or David Copperfield, for instance. But yes, I think those are examples of books that have been adapted in multiple ways. I'm also thinking about transmedial adaptations, if you know of any, if those texts have been like adapted for television, for cinema, for visual, more visually driven editions, so more largely illustrated editions, and how this censorship of girlhood and empowering models of girlhood has been preserved or betrayed in a sense.
Yeah, the Emily series has actually been made into a Canadian TV series, maybe in the 90s or the early 2000s. And well, that was of course a very big adaptation. So it began with Montgomery's plot, but then it was expanded and more drama was added and so on. A bit similar to, you may know, Anne with an E, the new Netflix series, which is based on another book by Montgomery, Anne of Green Gables. And that adaptation, I'd say it's like an ultra-feminist version of Montgomery's text. Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables has many feminist elements in it, but the thing we see in Anne with an E is just something that Montgomery couldn't write at that time. She couldn't write that strongly feminist text, but now people that adapt the text can make them appeal to the viewers of today and kind of bring up the issues that are important today. So, for example, in Anne with an E, they even add other issues that were not there in Montgomery's text, like racism was an issue that's not much discussed in Montgomery's text, and she, in fact, could be a little bit racist herself because it was just the time. But in the adaptation, they wanted to highlight this and bring in all of the kind of people that Montgomery did not write about.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's adaptation you can do a lot of things with adaptation and still have like the original core, but then it becomes very different and you add new plots and maybe develop the characters in other directions.
The narrative as well as the ideological reach of the original text. And I don't know what happened to Anne with an E in the Nordic countries. Did he have a similar like faith as Hamley, or was it not altered as much, if you know?
Oh, you mean like the Anne of Green Gables books?
Yeah.
Yes, they underwent a similar adaptation process as the Emily books. This was something that happened to all like girls' fiction that was translated at this time. So Louisa May Alcott's books were like similarly abridged also. A lot of the abridgment had to do with this page count thing, that it was cheaper to produce like books of a standard length, and that was also a practical reason to why these long books had to be abridged.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Great. That's very fascinating. I really want to learn more, and I'm thinking of getting those books because they look intriguing. Do we have other questions for our speaker today? Take a moment if you want to jump in with your mic, or if you want to write your question. I'm looking at my notes to see if I have. One thing that really struck me was the preserving throughout all or the majority of the book covers, the book element. So, and even adding like elements like in additional signs of ownership, like the name. You know? So in a sense, they convey from the very beginning, from the very entryway, considering the cover as such, to its public an idea of girlhood that is educated, that is deeply bookish, which also fulfills a certain ideal of femininity that is kept within, that if kept within the domestic sphere, can be domesticated and bent to certain conventions, but when brought outside, it can become dangerous because it can lead to freedom and to like material and financial independence as well as intellectual one. So it's interesting that they are keeping it as a recurring element even in the outside world, because with the third installment you have her going into the world and you see her like the beautiful woman dressing very fashionably and with a book with her name on it. So that's interesting, but it looks like it also clashes, like there's an element of perhaps disappointment for the readership as they read the work, the adapted work, and realize that perhaps the promise is going unfulfilled or only partially fulfilled.
Yeah, that is unfortunate, but actually today the last installment has been translated into Swedish and Norwegian as well. So now we actually have 4 Emily books in Sweden and in Norway, and I just didn't include it here because this was only about the 1950s period. But yeah, we have had that huge omission from the end has been replaced now. So we can read about Emily publishing her novel in Swedish as well, which
amazing.
is great, because in the 50s it was indeed a disappointment that she never became an author.
Exactly. So a promise of girlhood unfulfilled, unrealized, like a girlhood that never turns into a womanhood in a sense, or in like a model of independent womanhood, proto-feminist womanhood, as you said. I think this was excellent, truly, truly excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. Do we have any other questions? 1 minute to type yours if this last question really stirred anything in you. In the meantime, I want to remind you about our very last seminar, which will be a roundtable that is scheduled for the 5th of December, and during which we're gonna think together about the themes and the topics that have been raised throughout our seminar series over the past few weeks. So I really invite you to participate, because I think it will be an extraordinary opportunity for confrontation and exchange, and seeing where girlhood studies are going and what can we do to contribute to the evolution of this field of investigation. It's so interdisciplinary, it's so rich and filled with potential that I think we need to go after. I just want to thank deeply Laura for being with us today. Thank you very much for your wonderful paper. I really look forward to hearing more about your work, and I hope you can join us on the 5th of December. In the meantime, join me in a round of clap of hands to her. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you very much, Antonella. Antonella says it's such an interesting initiative. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my colleague Olga could not be here with us today, but she will be on the 5th of December. I'm just using her Zoom account, but I'm one of the co-organizers, so I have the authorization for it. Thank you very much again, Laura. And I wish you all a very nice evening. Bye-bye.